Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am back with a review of another Agatha Christie novel set abroad, or mostly abroad, as the case is, The Man in the Brown Suit, celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2024. This is a big centennial birthday for a Christie novel I didn't really know that well. I know the inside and out of most Christie novels, but this is one of the ones I'm less familiar with, at least before my reread of it for this video. And I have to say, I think this is the best standalone Christie thriller. Excluding the ones that don't feature Tommy and Tuppence. And when I ranked every non Poirot, non Marple novel, I did have The Man in the Brown Suit below the Seven Dials mystery. I would definitely have it above the Seven Dials mystery now, and that would make it the best, standalone thriller. And as a reminder, the way my review videos work is I will have a spoiler free summary mixed with commentary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which point I will let you know it's happening so you can back out before the spoilers arrive. And from that point forward, spoilers are fair game. And because this is an adventure thriller, the cutoff place isn't necessarily clear, so I give it my best judgment. Thrillers sometimes reveal and solve elements of the plot well before the end. Before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. The Man in the Brown Suit begins with a prologue where a Russian dancer named Nadina is chatting with a fellow Russian count. The two are agents of a mysterious figure called the Colonel, who runs a criminal enterprise but has recently retired. Nadina intends to blackmail the Colonel about some diamonds that were stolen. The Count warns her not to do this because the Colonel is dangerous, but Nadina is not worried because her husband from South Africa is coming in on a boat to help her with this scheme. Nadina also drops a hint that she had a past lover, also from South Africa, who helps her steal the diamonds, although he is now dead, with the Count wondering if that's really the case. And this is such a classic early Christie adventure thriller. A large, secretive criminal enterprise run by a shadowy figure known only by some vague nickname is a staple of these early Christie thrillers. And these kinds of Christies, there's often a murder, but it's not really central to the plot, and the mystery focuses primarily on unmasking the shadowy figure rather than solving the actual murderer. And it's very Scooby-Doo-esque, honestly, and it's enjoyable at times. It does get a little ridiculous, but always enjoyable. The narrative shifts to Anne Beddingfeld, who is our first person narrator for most of the book. Anne is the secretary to her father, a very stodgy and boring professor of Paleolithic man. Anne hates this because her father doesn't make any money, doesn't care that he's poor, and she longs for adventure and excitement. Her scatterbrained father pretty quickly dies of pneumonia because he didn't listen to Anne. He went outside in the cold without a coat on and died. Anne is left essentially penniless with nowhere to go. She declines several marriage proposals from really awful men because, again, she wants the adventure and not to be the wife's secretary to some creepy doctor or whatever. Anne moves to London with her father's lawyer because she thinks London is a better place to find adventure. While leaving an extremely unsuccessful and, quite frankly, awful job interview, Anne goes to the Hyde Park tube station where she notices a man in a coat that smells like mothballs. Because it's the middle of winter, Anne guesses that this man has just arrived from abroad, from someplace warmer. The man turns to her and sees something behind her that frightens him. And we see this kind of thing often in Christie, although I think this might actually be the first time she uses this, where someone sees something unknown and in the distance or behind someone and becomes frightened and dies. The man panics and falls onto the tracks. A doctor rushes up and proclaims him dead, but Anne finds something very strange about this doctor, although she can't initially figure it out. The doctor takes off and Anne chases him. Although she loses him, she does find a scrap of paper the doctor dropped that reads 17.122 Kilmorden Castle. Moreover, the paper smells like mothballs, which means it belonged to the dead man. At the inquest, the death is declared an accident, and the man is identified as L.B. Carton, and he had a note about checking out a house. The next day, an attractive woman is found strangled to death in that same house. The house is owned by Sir Eustace Pedler, an MP who is vacationing in the French Riviera. The woman is not identified, and the police believe the death of the so-called mothball man at the tube station and this foreign woman at Mill House are unrelated. Anne, however, still desperate for excitement, believes otherwise, or at least she hopes otherwise. You can feel a lot of a young Agatha Christie in Anne Beddingfeld. Anne is the best thing about this novel, and it's her presence that's the sole thing that prevents me from thinking this would have been better as a Tommy and Tuppence adventure. Scotland Yard is no help, even when Anne tells them the doctor from the tube station was a fake, and she knows this because he didn't act like a doctor. Anne worked as a nurse in World War One, so she knows doctors, and boy, if that isn't Agatha Christie, I don't know what is. Anne goes to the Daily Budget, which is a really trashy tabloid newspaper where Lord Naseby, the owner, agrees that he can pay her for information provided she finds something worth publishing. Anne goes to Mill House under the pretense of renting it. There, she meets Mrs. James, Sir Eustace's cook, who lives in the nearby lodge. Mrs. James says the foreign woman came by to the lodge to view the house. Mrs. James gave her the keys, but did not accompany her up to the house. A few moments later, our titular man in the brown suit showed up and said he was a friend of the woman, and Mrs. James sent him up to the house. A few moments later, the man returned the keys and said they weren't interested. Mrs. James noted the man in the brown suit seemed nervous and pale, and she did not see the woman, whose body was discovered the next day. Anne doesn't find anything interesting at the Mill House, although she does find a canister of film that smells like mothballs, but it's blank. At this point, Anne suspects the doctor from the tube station and the man in the brown suit might be the same person. She also notices a sign advertising the sailing of the Kilmorden Castle, a ship departing from Southampton to Cape Town on January 17th, 1922. Anne spends all of her money on a first-class ticket. The narrative cuts now to Sir Eustace, and I'm generally not a fan of jumping around with multiple narrators. There is a way to do this, but I don't think Christie pulls it off smoothly here. Sir Eustace was in the Riviera with his overly efficient secretary, Guy Pagett, when he receives word of the murder in his house. He begrudgingly returns to England and is angry that he did because there was really no reason for him to do so. He absolutely did not want to give up his vacation for this. And while in England, he's asked to transport some sensitive papers to Jan Smuts, who is a real-life general who was really lauded in his day, although not so fondly remembered now. We'll just leave it at that. Sir Eustace does not want to do this, but he's convinced to sail on the Kilmorden Castle. However, Guy Pagett suddenly comes down with an illness, with the not-so-subtle implication that he was actually poisoned. Sir Eustace is given a new secretary, whose name is Harry Rayburn, although Harry hesitates when asked what his name is, and is described with a tanned face and other descriptors that strongly resemble the physical description of the man in the brown suit. Aboard the Kilmorden, Anne is seasick for 3 days. She's very Hercule Poirot here, who, he always suffers from seasickness, unless he needs not to for plot purposes. She eventually gets dragged on deck, where she meets a Mrs. Suzanne Blair, who is the life of the party, and Mrs. Blair is accompanied by Colonel Race, who I've never particularly been fond of or found interesting in any of his appearances. To be honest, this is probably his most interesting appearance, and at best, he's just okay. Mrs. Blair tells Anne that she can switch her cabin because hers is terrible. Anne does get the purser to give her a better cabin, cabin number 13, but she doesn't want number 13 because she's superstitious, so she's given number 17. And this causes an argument between Anne, a reverend named Chichester, and Guy Pagett, who somehow did make the ship after all. Both men insist they need number 17, which Anne cannot understand because number 13 is a much bigger and better cabin, and the purser sides with Anne, so Anne gets number 17. But then someone apparently put a nausea-inducing gas into her air vent in that cabin in the hopes that Anne would abandon it. This causes Anne to realize the numbers on the scrap of paper didn't refer to the date of January 17th, 1922, but rather cabin 17 at 1 a.m. on the 22nd. So she is even more resolute in not giving up this cabin. And sure enough, at 1 a.m., a man bursts into Anne's cabin. He doesn't give his name or why he's there, other than to say that someone is after him. The man has been stabbed, which Anne treats this wound, and he disappears. Anne was somewhat disappointed that her big adventure was of that, but she's not giving up. She doesn't believe Reverend Chichester is a real reverend because he doesn't act like one, and he doesn't seem to know all that much about religion. And we learn like a bunch of information here, kind of like all in a row, very like haphazardly thrown at us. So I'll run it down here as quickly as I can. Mrs. Blair also had a weird incident in the middle of the night where a porter returned her lost film roll by throwing it at her through the air vent, which was weird. That's not normally how someone returns lost items to other people. Sir Eustace learns that Colonel Race is actually a Secret Service member, or rumored to be. Sir Eustace is fed up with Guy Pagett and his strong work ethic and wonders why he blushes whenever the city of Florence is mentioned. The other secretary, Harry Rayburn, has been so sick he hasn't left the cabin in days. But most interestingly, Colonel Race seems to be testing Anne Beddingfeld to make sure she really is who she says she is, which she finds a little humorous. She also finds Colonel Race attractive, but there is something about him that makes her hesitant. Colonel Race tells a story about a theft of diamonds from De Beers, apparently perpetrated by two friends named John Eardsley and the other named simply Lucas. Eardsley was caught up in the theft, but De Beers was paid off, so the charges were dropped, and then John died during World War One. No one knows where Lucas is. Colonel Race also claims to be the heir of John Eardsley's wealthy father now that his son is dead. Anne confides in Suzanne. She tells her the man who burst into her cabin was Harry Rayburn, whom both women are confident is the man in the brown suit, although Anne thinks he's innocent of murder. They also determine the Reverend Chichester probably stabbed Harry that night. And Mrs. Blair has a different interpretation of that scrap of paper. She thinks it doesn't read 17-1-22, but rather 1-71-22, as in 1 a.m. cabin 17 on the cabin 71 on the 22nd. Mrs. Blair has cabin 71, although it was booked by Nadina, the Russian dancer from the prologue, who never came on board. Anne opens the film canister that the steward dropped on Mrs. Blair and finds uncut diamonds, probably the diamonds from Colonel Race's jewel theft story. Putting two and two together, Anne realizes the dead woman in the mill house is Nadina, and the dead mothball man from the tube station paid the porter to drop the film canister on that night. Mrs. Blair tells Anne to wire Lord Naseby and confirm the whereabouts of the man in the brown suit to claim the reward. But Anne refuses to do this. She thinks Harry is innocent, and she's also head over heels in love with him, which you kind of saw coming in the way she tended his wounds. It was very, like, I don't know, like island love story type thing, really cheesy, but we've seen very little of Harry Rayburn at this point, and that was the only communication these two had, so it does feel a little strange on that front. Anne tackles Guy Pagett over not being in Florence when he said he was, and basically tricks him into admitting that he was actually in and around Millhouse when he said he was in Italy. This causes Guy Pagett to strangle Anne, but she's saved by Harry Rayburn, who also threatens to murder her. Anne finds all of this danger thrilling, which, is a bit uncomfortable. It's not exactly the kind of adventure I think readers would be expecting Anne to enjoy. It reminded me a lot of, like, the uncomfortable, danger-seeking strangulation from Taken at the Flood. Anne tells Harry that she knows he is both the man in the brown suit and Mr. Lucas, the missing partner from the diamond heist. Guy Pagett also figures this out and tells Sir Eustace. The Kilmorning Castle arrives in Cape Town, where Anne and Mrs. Blair, who is also now just like totally enthralled by this adventure, agree to split up. Anne is supposed to follow Chichester to Durban, while Mrs. Blair got herself invited to Rhodesia by Sir Eustace, and she's bringing Colonel Race along with her. Anne, however, falls into a pretty obvious trap and gets held in a house in Cape Town. Meanwhile, Sir Eustace delivers that package to the Prime Minister, only it's blank. When Sir Eustace telegrams back to England, he also learns that no one sent him Harry Rayburn as a secretary as he thought. Anne is bound and gagged, but she breaks free pretty easily. But instead of escaping, she decides to search the house she's being held in and sees Reverend Chichester, whom we can safely assume is not really a reverend, talking with her captor about how they work for the Colonel, who is after the diamonds. Anne eventually escapes and returns to the hotel with Mrs. Blair. Anne decides not to pursue Chichester after all because she lost track of him and she's not sure if he actually went to Durban or not. She's going to stay in Cape Town to follow Guy Pagett, whom Sir Eustace is not taking to Rhodesia because he has like this unprofessional black eye from when he got attacked, and also just because he hates Guy Pagett. Suzanne is still going with Sir Eustace and Colonel Race to Rhodesia, along with Sir Eustace's new secretary, Mrs. Pettigrew, who is exactly the female version of Guy Pagett Sir Eustace was hoping to avoid. Harry Rayburn had disappeared after it became publicly known that he was the man in the brown suit, so Anne stays in Cape Town, although she pretended to go off to Durban because Guy Pagett essentially dragged her to the train station to see her off, but she escapes with the help of Suzanne. Anne notices she is being followed by a man with a big nose who frames her for pickpocketing, also with the help of Guy Pagett. Anne flees to safety and barely makes it on the train to Rhodesia with the others. She takes over as Sir Eustace's secretary, which is really what the MP wanted the whole time. He's been oddly attracted to Anne as well, although he won't admit it. Anne does a bit of shopping for wooden animal carvings with Suzanne, and by a bit, I mean a lot. She buys something like 40 of them, and they can't even carry them all on the train, and Sir Eustace just hates them because they're everywhere. They put them in his cabin. Anne also does a little sightseeing with Colonel Race, who proposes marriage to her, but Anne declines. She doesn't like Colonel Race and finds him just too cruel. Anne falls for yet another pretty obvious trap and winds up falling off the train or jumping off of the train down a waterfall for safety. She comes to in a small African village in a jungle where Harry Rayburn is taking care of her. She's been unconscious for a month, apparently, because that's totally realistic. And this is where the novel takes a sudden and dramatic shift downward and goes completely off the rails, just like Anne went off the rails. It's also where I end the spoiler free section. It's hard to determine the exact place I should stop here in this thriller novel, but I think this is as good a point as any, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. Harry proclaims his love for Anne, and this gets a little icky, which I'll save for the criticism section. The important plot stuff here is mostly told to us in an info dump. Harry admits to being Harry Lucas, and he says he and Eardsley were duped by a South African woman named Anita Gruberg, who had connections with De Beers, and she is the one who stole the diamonds with the help of her husband and framed Eardsley and Lucas. Eardsley died in the war, and Lucas was presumed dead, but he actually deserted and lives on that tiny island in Africa. Anita is Nadina, the dancer, and her husband is the mothball man. Harry states he believes Sir Eustace is the colonel, but changes his mind to Guy Pagett. However, Pagett couldn't have been the one who tricked Anne on the train because he was still in Cape Town, so something is off here. Anne and Harry escape a rather melodramatic shooting on this island by swimming through crocodile-infested waters like they're like Steve Irwin or something. Meanwhile, Sir Eustace is bothered by everyone who is worried about Anne. He can't be bothered with this, and he gets a lot of conflicting information about where Anne is. Suzanne sent a telegram that she has Anne in one place, but Colonel Race says Anne is somewhere else. He also gets word that Miss Pettigrew has been seen multiple times coming out of a store that's been a known front for criminal activity. Anne is actually with Suzanne and Kimberly, and I should say the very end of this book is very convoluted and difficult to follow, that I'm just going to sum it up as quickly as possible. There's a lot of characters scattering about in different cities across South Africa, and then they aren't in those cities, and Suzanne has trunks all over the place that's difficult to keep track of. But basically, Suzanne was nervous because she still had the diamonds on her, so she put the diamonds in one of her trunks and left that trunk with Sir Eustace, who is in a totally different part of South Africa. And why she does this, I really don't know. She just didn't want them on her person, so she left them with a semi-total stranger. Whatever. Guy Pagett admits he was never in Florence, but returned to England because for the last 8 years he had a secret wife and 4 children he didn't tell Sir Eustace about for very flimsy reasons. I think the implication is that Sir Eustace wouldn't have hired him if he knew Guy Pagett had a family, because families are like distracting from work, but Sir Eustace really does not care at all. And Guy Pagett also suspects Miss Pettigrew is really a man, which is a revelation not all that shocking to the reader. I'm not sure if we were supposed to be shocked here or not, because it was pretty obvious from the moment we meet her that she's really a man. But Guy Pagett also drops a line about how he saw Sir Eustace in and around Millhouse at the same time, which was something that was casually dropped earlier in the novel but didn't get focused on. Meanwhile, Anne receives a telegram signed Harry. We know the real telegrams from Harry to Anne are to be signed Andy as a code, but Anne follows the directions anyway, and the reader is pretty well alerted that she knows this is a trap, but she's doing it anyway because this is part of her plan. This is not like an instance earlier where she fell for a pretty obvious kidnapping ploy, but she finds the Reverend Chichester, again, who doubled as Miss Pettigrew, and is really an actor named Minks. He was also the Count from the prologue. Anne says she wants to be taken to Sir Eustace, whom is the Colonel. In a very melodramatic and James Bond villain-esque speech, Sir Eustace admits all of this and agrees to let Anne go if she marries him, which she declines because she loves Harry. And what do you know, Sir Eustace says he found the diamonds, but they turn out to be fake because Suzanne hid the real diamonds in the belly of a wooden giraffe. Harry and Colonel Race save the day. Anne and Harry get together, but instead of living in England with his riches, they move back to Africa where Anne can be a subservient wife to Harry. In a moment, again, I'll talk about more in my criticism section. Oh, and Harry Lucas isn't really Harry Lucas. He is actually John Eardsley and going to inherit all that money from his father, but he gives it all up because he wants to live as a caveman, basically, in Africa, so Colonel Race gets all that money. Sir Eustace escapes from jail and writes to Anne, much to her pleasure, because she actually likes Sir Eustace and is glad he got away with it. The end. Let's talk about praise. My reread of this novel was my best experience with it. I absolutely enjoyed it this time in a way I had not in the past. When I ranked every non-Poirot, non-Marple Christie novel, I had The Man in the Brown Suit number 16 of 21, and I would move it up at least a few spots to like number 13, where it would now pass Why Didn't They Ask Evans, The Seven Dials Mystery, and By the Pricking of My Thumbs. Although the last one I am a bit iffy on, I'm like 50-50 there. I found this book to be very grounded for a thriller. Sometimes these thrillers get way out of hand and go off the rails, and The Man in the Brown Suit only has little blips of that, mostly towards the end, and I'm willing to accept ridiculous things in a thriller much more so than I would in a traditional mystery novel. This novel is just such a light, jaunty adventure. It's a lot of fun and mostly makes sense. The first 75% of the novel is good. I enjoy the beginning with Anne's little backstory and her adventurous spirit and looking into the murders. I think the height of the novel is aboard the Kilmorton Castle, where there's a lot of like very mysterious intrigue going on over, the cabin numbers and what everyone is doing and what that cryptic note means. I actually think the cryptic note makes sense here. I'm usually pretty critical of cryptic clues in novels like this, and don't think it's getting away scot-free either. I do knock it a bit, but it's not really as bad as other cryptic clues. I found the characters to be very enjoyable for the most part. I recently put Anne Beddingfeld on my greatest one-time Christie character list, but the other characters are great as well, at least in terms of the entertainment value they bring. I found Guy Pagett and his stuffiness to be a lot of fun, especially like with his interactions with Sir Eustace and Sir Eustace nagging him about how much he works and all that. The dynamic between Sir Eustace and Guy Pagett was great. They worked off each other very well. Suzanne Blair was a fun presence. Harry Rayburn, he had some moments. He wasn't the greatest in my opinion, but he wasn't a total dud. Even some of the minor characters, I know I won't talk about them in the character section. They had their fun little moments. The lawyer and his wife, Lord Naseby, Anne's father, all had little quirks that stuck with me. And I think Christie does a very good job of portraying the travel journey without it becoming a travel log. You get to experience this journey through Anne's eyes, and you can feel her sense of delight as she undertakes this adventure and becomes free and independent for the first time in her life. I find The Man in the Brown Suit to be a very good, solid adventure thriller. It's not top tier Christie by any means, but it's a very good, solid novel, especially for a thriller. Unfortunately, I do have a lot of criticism, and it does mostly stem from this book being an adventure thriller rather than a mystery. It has all the problems a thriller typically has, in that, it goes off the rails at times, and at times it seems like Christie is just throwing random events together and seeing what happens with them. My main specific problem is the ending. That is, first of all, the ending is very rushed and it gets very bizarre, which is also jarring because the first three quarters of this book were not strange at all. Once the characters leave the ship, I think there's a noticeable downturn in quality and credibility. The ending is very hard to follow because characters are all over the place and lying about where they are and what items they have with them. It's not incomprehensible, but it isn't particularly smooth or well executed. I do not like the very end where Anne Beddingfeld relinquishes her newfound independence and adventurous spirit to be a subservient wife to Harry Rayburn. The way Christie writes this is almost like caveman, cavewoman thing going on. It's completely uncharacteristic of Anne and even Harry to some extent, and it's very uncomfortable. And no, I don't mean it like to say that it's wrong for her to want to be a wife or even like a homemaker, but just the way it's presented, it's a little very old fashioned, very icky, very like alpha male versus subservient female that doesn't come across as relatable, especially since we're supposed to be happy for them here. In terms of execution of this book, I have issues. There are multiple info dumps. There's one in the prologue. There's one when Colonel Race tells his backstory about the diamonds, and there's another one at the end when Harry sums things up. It's just not interesting to be presented all of this information really quickly in one paragraph or two. I didn't find Harry to be that interesting of a character. I actually found him probably the most forgettable major character, despite him being the titular character. And it's tough for me to assess why I don't like about The Man in the Brown Suit because it's an adventure thriller, which I think just has a lower ceiling to begin with. But the criticisms I have don't necessarily matter too much either because, you know, I go into thrillers sort of expecting these issues, so when they come up, it's already sort of like built into my opinion going in. And The Man in the Brown Suit does have less of these issues than like other Christie adventure thrillers like, Destination Unknown and Passenger to Frankfurt, which I think are just overall completely subpar compared to this. And there's some other minor things as well. Anne in particular has odd views about shapes of people's heads and whether or not they have criminal tendencies. It gets dangerously close to eugenics and phrenology, without ever actually getting there. I think the plot could have been tidied up, but, it's not egregious. And I also think Colonel Race, I never found him interesting, and I didn't find him interesting here either. Let's move on to characters, and there aren't too many notable ones to talk about because a lot of the characters are fleeting here. Starting out with our main sleuth, who I would consider to be Anne Beddingfeld. I recently put her on my top 30 one time Christie characters, and I stick by that. I love her adventurous spirit and her wit. I think she's a good balance of amateur sleuth who at least has some idea of what she's doing without it getting ridiculous. She often references The Perils of Pauline, which was a very popular serialized film with an adventurous young woman, very much like Anne. Pauline, I believe, is the origin of like the woman tied to the railroad tracks meme, not meme, but that trope. She got herself in all kinds of trouble, just like Anne does, and I enjoyed experiencing this adventure through the eyes of Anne Beddingfeld. She's the perfect narrator for this story. She reminds me a lot of Tuppence, and like I said, I think this book easily could have been a Tommy and Tuppence, with Tuppence in the Anne spot and Tommy in the Harry Rayburn spot. But it's Anne that makes me think otherwise. I would have hated to have missed out on Anne Beddingfeld. And while I certainly quibble about her ending and some of her views, I still think Anne is a fantastic character and really makes this book. Colonel Race, again, never a big fan of him. I would actually say this is probably his best book in terms of like Colonel Race content. And at best, he's fine. He's totally extraneous and useless in Death on the Nile, and overshadowed by bigger personalities in Cards on the Table and Sparkling Cyanide. And to an extent, he's overshadowed here as well by Anne Beddingfeld, but at least in The Man in the Brown Suit, he serves a different role than the person overshadowing him, giving him some distance. He's not really our detective force in this book. He's actually something of a decoy suspect, being Colonel Race with the shadowy villain named the Colonel, and also having like personal connections to the diamond theft and other characters. And he's in a similar position as Christie's villain in her other, previously published thriller at this time, The Secret Adversary. He does things similar to what Sir Eustace does, like propose marriage to Anne and keeps tab on her. I found him like completely generic in this book, and I'm sure others will disagree, but he does rescue Anne towards the end and serves a purpose in arresting Sir Eustace, so there's that. But Sir Eustace escapes, so he doesn't even do that right. Our murderer slash big villain of the piece is Sir Eustace Pedler. When I ranked every Christie culprit, Sir Eustace was number 70 of 100, and I stand by that relatively low position. That ranking was based more so on the murderer's, plot, which I don't necessarily find compelling. The murderer and even the heists aren't like really what this book is about. Now, if that list had been more based on character content, Sir Eustace is much higher. I loved his character, and it was a huge breath of fresh air having this like jovial, lighthearted, and humorous character being the big bad. I loved his antics with Guy Pagett and how Pagett is this efficient workaholic who is constantly bothering Sir Eustace about his work when Sir Eustace just wants to be left alone and not work, and he's going out like telling Guy Pagett like go be interesting and like commit a crime for God's sake, like do something interesting and leave me alone. And he's also a complainer, but in a very humorous way. I loved when he had to complain like he had to go back to England because someone was murdered in his house. He's just like, I don't know what this has to do with me. He's cranky, but in an endearing manner, so much so that everyone in the book really likes him. I like the ending he receives where, he is arrested, but he escapes. And Anne is fine with this because Sir Eustace brought her the excitement she wanted, and she doesn't really look at him as the bad guy, despite murdering at least 2 people and probably more. And I have to say, as a reader, I was also a little happy, Sir Eustace gets away with it. It feels like the right kind of person if you are going to let someone escape justice. His accomplice of sorts is the character actor Arthur Minks, another criminal actor in the Christieverse, and this is tough to assess because we don't really see Minks as Minks that much. We mostly see him as like the Reverend Chichester and Miss Pettigrew and the Count, and he's also a stock character as the master criminal's accomplice who dresses up as different people. He reminded me a lot of Kitty Kidd from The Mystery of the Blue Train. That's not a spoiler because you don't know who that is, but I found him to be a fun character, although not one particularly memorable or unique in any way. He's not like particularly good as a reverend because he didn't know anything about religion, and he seems to be pretty incompetent as well, as he's constantly caught in compromising situations and is picked pretty early on in all of his impersonations as a phony. And again, whether that's Reverend Chichester not knowing religion or Miss Pettigrew acting like a man and having like a razor with her, he brought some humor to the book, but again, not a particularly memorable presence in the grand scheme of things. I'm not going to talk about our victims as they don't really serve any real plot purpose, to be honest, so I'll move into regular characters. Harry Rayburn, aka Harry Lucas, really John Eardsley. I did not find Harry to be that interesting as I think he was intended to be. He's not actually in the book as much as I think he needed to be. He is our titular man in the brown suit, but it's about halfway into the book we meet him as him, and he spends much of the book just being sidelined and away from the action. And when he is being used, I did not find him compelling. I didn't understand Anne's attraction to him, although I did appreciate his role in the novel as sort of like the prime suspect who is really interested, really innocent, and it was done in an interesting way where it was still believable he could have been guilty. I just found his backstory ridiculous and never felt this like profound sense of interest from him. He seemed like a character you could find in many Christie novels, especially thrillers. He didn't stand out to me in any way. Mrs. Suzanne Blair, however, I loved. She was a fun presence. She was very similar to Anne in that she wanted independence and adventure, but was more experienced at it. I loved her constant shopping and buying all of those wooden animals. She was just having a good time for the sake of having a good time. Her spending habits bothered her never seen husband, and I liked how she had a pretty important role in the novel as being, the recipient of the film canister and being the one who tricks her Eustace. She's a society lady and acts like it, but she's also willing to break sort of the social norm and reach out to Anne. She becomes Anne's closest friend, and their relationship is legitimate. It's not one out of like pity for the poor young lady. Suzanne to me was probably the brightest character in this novel outside of Anne. And the only other character worth mentioning is Guy Pagett, who I also enjoyed. Christie does a very good job in making him the red herring. He comes off as very suspicious and very clearly was not in Florence when he said he was. He gets very embarrassed when this is brought up, and knowing the truth that he wasn't committing crimes but actually hiding a family of 6 from Sir Eustace for no real reason was pretty funny. It actually makes a lot of sense. You do sort of get, like awkward loser vibes from him, but then when you find out about his secret life, you're actually happy for him, and you can see it coming. It's a great moment for Christie when she pulls back the curtain, and what was behind it was not what you thought was there, especially in a thriller where Christie typically doesn't pull these kinds of tricks on you. Guy Pagett is one of like many secretaries to wealthy men in Christie, and this is a character archetype she does often and does very well. Guy Pagett is not only written well but also a bit humorous. I enjoyed him quite a bit. He's definitely up there with Suzanne Blair and Anne Beddingfeld as good characters. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think of the man in the brown suit and Colonel Race. I'm curious to know what you people think of Colonel Race, because I'm not a particularly big fan of him, but I'm curious or not if that is a popular opinion. And after 100 years of the man in the brown suit, it doesn't necessarily have a big legacy, especially amongst Christie novels. It's not as famous as And Then There Were None or Death on the Nile, Murder on the Orient Express. But I think Christie fans who've read all of her works always come away positive on the man in the brown suit. It just hasn't reached its popularity as some of these other Christie novels. Next week, we have another review of an adventure thriller, and we are traveling to the south of France, not with Agatha Christie or any of her characters, but with Niall Marsh and her detective, Inspector Allen, his wife, Agatha Troy, and their son, little Ricky, in Spinsters in Jeopardy. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.